everyone, and welcome to today's program, Dare to Speak, a book talk with Suzanne Nossel. Before we begin, I would just like to let everyone know that for the month of October, the center will be offering free admission, although you need to reserve your tickets online in advance. Our upcoming programs are What Are Truth Commissions on October 2nd at 12 p.m., The Power of Naming on October 4th at 5 p.m., and as well as Spirit, focused on Indigenous art, artists and issues, October 12th at 12 p.m. A quick disclaimer, all comments of the moderators and guests of our programs represent the thoughts of each individual and do not represent an official position of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. Now I would like to introduce our panelists for this afternoon. Our first panelist is Suzanne Nossel. She is the CEO of PEN America, as well as the author of Dare to Speak. Suzanne Nossel is the Chief Executive Officer at PEN America. And prior to joining PEN America, she served as the Chief Operating Officer of Human Rights Watch and as Executive Director of the Amnesty International. She has served in the Obama administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations, leading U.S. engagement in the UN and multilateral institutions on human rights issues, and in the Clinton administration as deputy to the U.S. Ambassador for UN Management and Reform. Nossel coined the term smart power, which was the title of a 2004 article she published in the Foreign Affairs magazine and later became the theme of Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's tenure in office. She is a featured columnist for Foreign Policy magazine, has published op-eds in the New York Times, Washington Post, and LA Times, as well as scholarly articles in foreign affairs, Dissent, and democracy, among others. Nossel served on the board of directors of the Tides Foundation. She is a former senior fellow at the Century Foundation, the Center for American Progress, and the Council on the Foreign Relations. Nossel is a magna cum laude graduate of both Harvard College and Harvard Law School. Please welcome Suzanne Nossel.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Our next panelist is Professor Randall Kennedy. He is a professor at Harvard Law School. Randall Kennedy is a Michael R. Klein professor at Harvard Law School, where he teaches courses on contracts, criminal law, and the regulation of race relations. He was born in Columbia, South Carolina. For his education, he attended St. Alban School, Princeton University, Oxford University, and Yale Law School. He served as a law clerk for Judge J. Skelly Wright of the United States Court of Appeals and for, for Justice Thurgood Marshall on the United States Supreme Court. He is a member of the Bar and the District of Columbia and the Supreme Court of the United States. Awarded the 1999 Robert F. Kennedy Book Award for Race, Crime, and the Law, Mr. Kennedy writes for a wide range of scholarly and general interest publications. His other books are for discrimination, race, affirmative action, and the law, The Persistence of the Color Line, Racial Politics and the Obama Presidency, Sell Out, The Politics of Racial Betrayal, International Intimacies, Sex, Marriage, Identity, and Adoption, and the Strange Period of a Troublesome Word. A member of the American Law Institute, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Philosophical Association. Mr. Kennedy is also a trustee emeritus of Princeton University. Please welcome Professor Randall Kennedy.
Thank you very much.
You're so welcome.
Great, thanks so much for having us.
Indeed. So, Suzanne, congratulations on Dare to Speak. It's a very meaty book, very timely book, very interesting book. Let's jump into it.
Great, thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely, look forward to our conversation and look forward to getting questions from the audience after we have a chance to talk about your book. First, what prompted you to write it?
Sure, yeah, I'd say there's sort of two sets of origins that are foremost for me. The first is work that I did some years ago at the State Department during the Obama administration when I was overseeing US engagement at the UN Human Rights Council. And at the time, one of the issues on my plate was a resolution that Islamic majority countries were advocating to ban what they called the defamation of religion. This grew out of the Danish cartoons controversy where these caricatures of the Islamic prophet Muhammad had been published in a Danish newspaper, and it prompted riots and protests outside diplomatic installations around the world and created a huge uproar. And sort of in the wake of that, there was a lot of upset among the populations of these countries, and the governments kind of came together and they were seeking an international ban on that kind of religiously offensive content. So sort of like a ban on blasphemy. And as the United States, along with Europe, Canada, Australia, and others, we were adamantly opposed to this as a violation of free expression. We thought those cartoons constituted protected speech, and we were fighting them tooth and nail, sort of time and again, year after year, over this resolution in UN fora. And when I sort of read into the issue, it struck me as pretty absurd that we were going through this ritualized exercise and sort of duking it out over this resolution when, as the Obama administration, as people will recall, we're at the same time doing a lot of outreach to the Muslim world. The president's Cairo speech and efforts to build bridges to Muslim American communities in the period still not that long after 9/11. And so it seemed really sort of fruitless and pointless to be waging war over this free expression issue at the UN. And what we decided to do was change tactics and actually reach out to the Islamic Conference, which was sponsoring the resolution. And I traveled to Islamabad to deliver the message that we wanted to work with them on an alternative approach that would address their sensitivities to religious intolerance and tackle them through practical measures, things like dialogue and education and sharing best practices about how to prosecute hate crimes. And we were asking them to back away from this approach that would have banned speech. And, I won't say it sort of met a warm reception right away, but through a negotiation, we eventually came around to a consensus resolution, and they no longer sought this international treaty banning the defamation of religion. And what that signified for me was that this idea that the tension between trying to bring about a more equal, inclusive, and just world and the robust protection for free speech was soluble, that we could find approaches that staunch advocates of addressing religious intolerance and combating religious intolerance, as well as steadfast devotees to free speech principles could come together. And I would say that's been the governing principle. Now at PEN America, we do extensive work on free speech on college campuses, and it really is a similar tension that arises very often surrounding the drive for a more equal, inclusive, anti-racist campus, one where hate speech is not tolerated, where everybody is treated with respect, where denigrating comments and microaggressions are not commonplace. And the question of how you reconcile that with robust protections for free speech and academic freedom. And what we've learned sort of in the course of our work, which includes extensive engagements at many of the campuses that have really wrestled with these issues, including Berkeley, UVA Charlottesville, Middlebury, and elsewhere, is that people on both sides, whether they're advocates of social justice or the firm defenders of the First Amendment from the law school or on the faculty, can see one another's perspective, and that if we enter into dialogue and make some adjustments, I think there are ways to defend free speech unflinchingly, but still drive forward the goal of a more equal and inclusive society. And that really is sort of the paradigm that I wanted to put forward in this book. And so I set out 20 specific principles for how I think we can achieve that goal.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things that's interesting about your background is that you began with a international problem. I mean, an international standard, but much of your work has also involved work in the United States. On the international front, are you critical of other governments that are less expansive in terms of protections for freedom of expression? So for instance, are you critical of the fact that in many European countries, Nazism and the symbols of Nazism are prohibited? I mean, you were against the prohibition on, blaspheming things, blaspheming Islamic notions or icons or, the aspects of Islamic faith. What about other sorts of prohibitions in other settings? And I'll just use Nazism in, Germany.
Yeah, sure. Look, I mean, we spend a lot of time at PEN America criticizing violations of free expression around the world. We do a lot of work on China, on Myanmar, on Iran, on Russia. We spend less time criticizing democracies that, by and large defend free expression, but, to a degree lesser than provided for under the First Amendment. And, Europe is a good example. And the prohibition on Holocaust denial in most European countries is something that would not pass constitutional muster here, but that is, a treasured principle. And, you can understand why. In the wake of the Second World War, they would have, taken that step to address the scourge of anti-Semitism. And so it makes sense in the historical context, but I also think it's problematic. It actually would come up quite often in the context of this negotiation with the Islamic Conference, when we would say, well, we can't ban, caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad or defamation of the religion of Islam. They would say, well, but in Europe, Holocaust denial is banned. And so if you can have a law that impinges on free expression to protect the Jews, what about us? We're the ones who are being targeted now. And it actually was a great kind of point of strength for me as an American diplomat to be able to say, well, in the United States, we don't allow that. And we have a much more limited scope for prohibitions on speech, limited to incitement to imminent violence and a few other narrowly drawn categories. And so, our opposition to a prohibition on defamation was more principled in that, in that way. And so, to me, it's illustrative of the very difficult line drawing problems that you get into once you start expanding the power of governments to ban and prohibit speech. Holocaust denial is disallowed, but what about discussions of slavery that might be considered racist? Should that be prohibited as well? What about negative depictions of Muslims? What about misogynist content? There's all sorts of categories that I think we now recognize, represent forms of bigotry, can be deeply offensive, can be denigrating and even harmful to people who are on the receiving end of slurs and stereotyping. But if we gave our government the leeway to punish all those categories of content, I think our playing field for free speech would be substantially narrowed. And so I think, as problematic as it is, especially in recent years, to sort of see hateful speech uncorked and running freely through our society, I don't think the approach of empowering government to be more expansive in prohibiting and punishing it is the right one.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I think makes your book especially interesting is that while you do talk about the First Amendment, a lot, and while you do address government versus individual problems a lot, you also go beyond that. You talk about the sorts of things, the person to person or group to group issues that are outside of the realm of the First Amendment, and you speak not only to lawyers and courts, but you also talk to regular folks. For instance, your book calls on individual citizens to play a more active role in defending free speech. Could you talk about that more? What do you want individual citizens to do to protect and, in fact, expand the borders of freedom of expression?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, for most Americans, you sort of say free speech and they reflexively respond with First Amendment. And we're used to relying on courts and lawyers to defend those rights. But I'd say in my experience at PEN America, which is an organization of writers, editors, journalists, translators, publishers, so many of the issues that trouble people when it comes to freedom of speech, whether it's call outs or cancel culture or online harassment on social media, or simply vitriol and hateful speech in society and how to navigate it, really don't implicate the First Amendment. They're not about government prohibitions on speech, and that's all that the First Amendment really deals with. It bans Congress and state legislatures and even public universities from impinging upon freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, religious freedom, but it says nothing about the rights of corporations to constrict the speech of their employees or social media platforms to define the parameters of the permissible online. And so I do think if we are going to defend free speech in the 21st century, that it requires more than simply a resort to lawyers and courts, and that as citizens, we need to engage in a mobilization on behalf of free speech. And that's a contentious proposition, and I think particularly so with a rising generation. I mean, you asked earlier about my motivations for writing the book, and I should have mentioned that for me, particularly going around to campuses, I hear a lot of alienation among young people about the principle of free speech. People believe that free speech is a smoke screen for hatred, and that in order to become a more equal and inclusive society, we need to ban and punish hateful speech. And I understand why people make that argument, and I agree that hateful speech can be harmful. I devote a whole chapter to looking at scientific evidence of the psychological and even physiological harm that can be wrought, particularly for members of vulnerable groups who are persistently, over the course of a year or even a lifetime, on the receiving end of slurs, stereotyping, microaggressions. I believe the impact of that is real, but I don't think the answer is empowering government to silence speech. And I argue in the book that in order to sort of make free speech work for our diverse, digitized, and divided society, there are certain responsibilities that redound to all of us. I kind of divide them into these 4 categories: principles to consider when you're a speaker, principles to consider when you're a listener, principles to follow when you're debating free speech questions, and principles to consider in looking at free speech policy issues. And my hope is that, if these ideas can take hold, that we will have a much more robust flank of defense for free speech, but also a recognition that free speech next needs to be exercised in ways that don't fuel the case for restricting it.
Okay. We've been talking about free speech, free speech, free speech. Let's go to the other side of things, though it might not be the other side of things: censorship. So in the last few years, in the commentary about struggles, especially on campuses, regarding freedom of expression, there's one episode that comes up over and over, or one difficulty that comes up over and over, and it's usually at the end of the school year, commencement. So you have the university, the trustees or the president of the university has invited somebody to come speak, and then some students say, we don't want to hear that person. And in fact, we are insisting that you rescind your invitation to that person. And when this happens, a lot of newspapers, or at least some very influential newspapers, jump into it and suggest that the people who are demanding disinvitations are acting in a censorious way. My question to you is, are they acting in a censorious way, or are they simply expressing themselves?
Sure. Look, I think there are elements of both. When you have a commencement speaker, that's different from a department at a university or a student group inviting someone to campus. And my view is that when it comes to who is authorized to make an invitation to a speaker to come to campus and give a talk, or do so on Zoom, as probably is happening this year, I think that policy should be very liberal. And that universities, I like the fact that just about any student organization or center or academic department typically has the authority to issue such invitations. And I think the administration should be loath to override those decisions. So let's say, somebody invites, there's a case I talk about in the book about an invitation at Bard to a German politician who's part of the far right. And he was invited to speak at a seminar on the rise of fascism, and there were widespread protests. People thought, he should not be given a platform at Bard, that this, represented a sort of endorsement of his views. I look at it differently. I think that was a very appropriate context in which to test out his views. It was a seminar of experts. People were challenging him. He had interlocutors who could rebut any falsehoods that he said. That doesn't negate the fact that on his social media, he could share a photograph of himself speaking at Bard with the Bard logo and the prestige that confers. And I think you have to recognize there is that measure of prestige, but I think by and large, we're better having that very open, freewheeling policy where all kinds of voices can be heard on campus. Now, when it comes to a commencement speaker, it's a bit different because that is a vaunted platform. There the university is saying, this is somebody really dignified and important, and with all of your families assembled here on this momentous day, we're going to ask you to sort of sit through this lecture by so-and-so. And I think that's a very different implication and much more of an organization, of an institutional endorsement of that persona and their viewpoint than is, simply another lecture on campus sponsored by the philosophy department. So what I advise is I think universities have to, and increasingly do, sort of take into account the stakeholders they represent and, how this choice is going to resonate with the students and their families and the faculty. I don't think universities should shy away from controversial choices, but I think there are different fora in which different sorts of voices can be presented. Now, when it comes to students who are protesting, they're within their rights to say that it was a wrong-headed decision to confer this honor on, so-and-so, let's say Condoleezza Rice, which was a controversy that erupted some years ago. That's freedom of speech rights that those students and faculty who protest enjoy. And I think the issue, and I devote a whole chapter to protesting without silencing, because where I do think it crosses over into censoriousness is when those protesters take it into their own hands to deny others the opportunity to hear from the speaker. And so if they come in and they drown the speaker out with pervasive heckling that is so loud and disruptive that essentially the speech can't go on, that to me is a sort of effort to trump the free speech rights of others. And I think our own free speech liberties sort of stop short of that kind of extension where we're running roughshod over the rights of others. And so what I advocate is I think there can be boisterous, vigorous, even loud protests, but that stop short of censoriousness. I think in those cases, though, the protest is less about the speech that so-and-so is going to give than about the university's decision to extend the honor to the individual. So I think a good solution would be, perhaps to if there are grounds to reconsider the honor, maybe do so, but ensure that the speech can go forward, maybe in a slightly different forum.
I understand, but I from what you just said, I gather that you are not one who is upset with people who say, no, I want this person disinvited. It might be embarrassing for the institution, but the institution made its decision. Now I'm simply making my decision. I'm making my decision known. I'm reaching out to other people as a collective matter to we're expressing our disapproval. We don't think there's anything wrong with that. I take it that you're agreeing with that basic belief. There's nothing wrong with that. This is just a political struggle. One group wanted to invite the person, again, for commencement. The officials wanted to invite the person. A group of students say, no, we don't like that. And then they struggle over it. I take it from what you're saying, that does not raise a freedom of expression problem.
Well, I think it does when the request is for a disinvitation that would have the net effect of preventing, let's say, Secretary Rice from being heard on campus. That deprives those who wanted to listen to her the opportunity to do so. It denies her a platform to share her views. And I think there is a problem when you allow, particularly, it's not necessarily a consensus view. Very often it's a loud minority that are trying to assert, what Nat Hentoff called the heckler's veto. The idea that the loudest segment of the mob gets to dictate what everybody hears and doesn't hear because they're so vociferous in their objections that they're effectively trumping the decision of administrators or students who might want to file into that auditorium and hear the speech. So I think that is problematic. I think, where it's this mark of distinction, let's say the conferring of an honorary degree. Say somebody's coming to campus to receive an honorary degree and people want to protest that, it's Henry Kissinger and he's a war criminal. I think they're within their rights to do so. Would Kissinger make a few remarks, when that degree is bestowed? Perhaps, but the protest there to me is not really centrally concerned with his speech. It's concerned with this honorific that the university wants to confer that people think is misplaced. And I think, they're entitled to express that view, and it doesn't necessarily cross over into censoriousness.
I want to push you one more time around the mulberry bush on this, though, because, the nature of an invitation, if an administration invites person A, that means that they are not inviting person B. Now, just because they're inviting person A doesn't mean that, is the non-invitation of person B censorship? I don't think so. Okay, so why isn't it simply a political struggle? Why is it even a question of freedom of expression, unless it seems to me it's a freedom of expression issue if people drown out the speaker. So let's suppose that they are unsuccessful in getting the administration to change its mind, and then they drown out the speaker. Okay, I see that. But prior to that, if you just have two groups that are writing, and even, you have two groups of people marching, and it's simply a political trial of strength, why are we talking about freedom of expression in that context?
Yeah, look, if you thought about the discussion that might happen and the lobbying that might go on before an invitation is extended, if I'm, whispering in the president's ear, demanding that he invite so-and-so, and you want that person's opposite number, we're both free to make our case. I don't think anybody, I don't think free expression would be implicated. I think where it comes into play is where an invitation has been properly extended. The president invited Condoleezza Rice to come to campus. she accepted. And then there's a minority that says, no, she can't be heard here. And, in effect, that is a kind of more polite and peremptory form of the heckler's veto, where they're saying, and like, let's put aside the issue of an honorary degree or commencement. Maybe she's just, invited to give a lecture, but by the president of the university, and people say that invitation ought to be rescinded. That is allowing, that segment of the population to triumph over the process, this liberal process where anybody can come to campus. And I think that is problematic. So I think something changes the minute that invitation is extended. And if at that point the lobbying is to rescind it, that's different than having argued, in the first place, it never, it should have been somebody else instead of her.
Although from the point of view of the dissatisfied students could very well say, listen, we weren't party. It'd be different if there was a debate before the invitation was extended, but typically not. Typically the way these things work is the president, the trustees, the big shots make their invitation. And the students then learn with the public, and then the students mobilize. So it seems that one can't or ought not make the extension of the invitation the dividing point. But we could go on, and that's one of the things that's so wonderful about the book, because these subjects are subjects about which, frankly, one could write articles, one could write books. Let me ask, but I want to go on to another one because our time together is limited. I want to go on to another one that's very controversial nowadays. And it has to do with the following. What do you think should be done when students write letters complaining to university officials about, let's say, a professor uttering the N-word aloud in class? So, for instance, just to put some meat on the bones on this one, a couple of months ago at a law school, a professor was talking about the origins of the American Constitution, and he quoted Patrick Henry making a comment about slavery and his fear that the federal government would come and take slaves away from slave owners. And in his conversation, in talking about this professor quoted what Patrick Henry was reported to have said, and what Patrick Henry was reported to have said involved the N-word. And there was a student who got very exercised about this and complained about it. And there was a controversy at the law school, and many people, the dean of the law school and a bunch of professors were extremely critical of this professor's referencing this term. What are your thoughts about that situation?
Yeah, I mean, look, I should be asking you that question because you've written a whole book about the topic. But I'll share a little bit about how I look at it. Then you can push back, and I hope you do. I would say I don't think people should be punished for speaking a word when they're not using it as a slur. And it's pretty easy. These cases have come up a lot, as you know, and it's pretty clear. When the N-word is being used in an academic or pedagogical context. And there used to be this notion of the use-mention distinction. So using the word as a slur, of course, unconscionable, but mentioning the word in a historical context or quoting somebody, considered an entirely different thing. I think what has happened is sort of the mores have shifted, and that what I've observed in our work on campus free speech is that, particularly for students, and I actually cite some polling in the book in connection with this, there really is no acceptance of that distinction. And even the mention, no matter the context, is regarded as sort of tantamount to using the word as a slur. And the problem is, I think a lot of professors sort of don't realize that. And once they do realize it, one of two things happen. I mean, either they sort of say, I didn't want to offend anybody, and my primary concern is to avoid offending anybody. I'm terribly sorry I did. I won't do it again. Or they sort of stick on principle to this use-mention distinction and say, you know, I was mentioning the word, I wasn't using the word, I wasn't using it as a slur. The intent and context that surround my usage of the word makes that perfectly clear. And, you know, I have the right to speak this word. And by saying that it's out of bounds, you know, that's impinging upon my free speech rights and on open discourse. And I think that's sort of where the debate right now lies. You know, my own feeling is people shouldn't be punished or disciplined when they're using the word in a way that it, you know, is not a slur and is not intended to be offensive. But you know, the first chapter of my book is about conscientiousness with language. And I really do think, as a matter of conscientiousness, that anybody who's teaching in a university campus today just ought to be aware of how this word is heard, and should think carefully about whether they want to say it, given the high probability that it could be misconstrued and interpreted as a slur. And, you know, I think you make the very important point in your work, you know, that I also reference about, you know, kind of how this plays out for different people. And I think it, you know, in practice, it's very different depending on whether it's a Black professor or a white professor. And we know that in rap lyrics, there are Black artists who have kind of reappropriated the word. And then there've been some incidents where, you know, the white backup singer sort of says the word as part of the song, and it's like, you know, no, you can't say it, even though, you know, this is part of the lyrics. So it gets complicated, but, you know, I think there's a certain logic to that of, you know, people, and you've done a lot to help people understand the unique velocity of this word, you know, as it has kind of ricocheted through American history, and just why it packs such a wallop. And I think when people appreciate that, you know, the actual circumstances in which you need to use the word or really can't get your meaning across without it are pretty limited.
Mm-hmm. Do you, we want to get the audience involved in just a moment. Let me ask you this. Your book covers a wide range of topics in very interesting ways. I want to sort of go back to my opening question. If you had one lesson that you wanted people to take away, if there was one central theme that you would like for people to take away from your book, what would it be?
That if you are a believer in social justice, in equality, in fostering a more inclusive society and combating racism, that free speech is your friend and not your enemy. That free speech is a tool you can use, and that is an essential set of safeguards to advance the goals that you are striving for, and that you ought to defend that as well as advocating for the causes that motivate you.
Mm-hmm. So breaking down a division that seems to have arisen, and it's an ironic, and at least from my view, sad, that the forces of freedom of expression and the forces of social justice, I mean, throughout, in most eras of American history, those camps have marched together.
Yeah.
If one thinks about the abolitionists, for instance, I mean, if one thinks about the second Reconstruction, the great flowering in the 20th century, the greatest flowering of freedom of legal doctrines favoring freedom of expression, were flowerings that accompanied the second Reconstruction, the civil rights movement. And so, but we do seem to see, unfortunately, a situation in which sometimes these camps seem to be in tension with one another. And I hear you to say that that's an illusion. It's a false. It's a false rivalry and a destructive rivalry, and a rivalry that I hear you urging people to cease.
Yeah, I mean, I've been asked a question, and I'm sort of curious what you think about why it is that sort of historic, people say to me, during the civil rights era, there was this recognition that free speech rights were elemental to the struggle, but now it seems as though those driving forward to the next levels of the realization of the goals of that movement are kind of turning their back on free speech. And why is that? And one answer I've given, which I'm curious if you agree with, is that then it was sort of about more de jure forms of equality, eradicating barriers, segregation in schools and public accommodations and employment, all kinds of other settings. And now, a lot of those obstacles have been swept away. And what we're left with is this kind of more entrenched, harder to reach level and layer of racism that pervades in our society and culture. And that really does kind of go more to the ways in which we think about one another and express ourselves and communicate with each other. And so it's kind of understandable that in tackling those, there are these, at least questions about whether we might not be better off, with some more restrictions on how we communicate and describe each other. And so, that is an answer I've given, and I'm curious if you think that accounts for it, or if to you it's other factors.
These things, of course, are very complicated, but I think, among other things, that there is the problem of amnesia. So, for instance, when I speak about these issues, one of the things that I've been focusing on campus is the following, which I think has been lost to history. If one asks the question, who is it that brought judicially recognized rights to freedom of expression on campus? Who was behind that? People don't know the answer to that. People simply have forgotten the answer to that. The answer to that is Black students fighting segregation in the early and mid 1960s. Those were the students. They were thrown off their campuses. They were being repressed. They demanded that the courts revisit the issue. Before the 1960s, students in public universities and private universities had no rights, none. If the president of the university said, "I don't like the way you're looking, scram," there was nothing to be done. It was Black students who demanded, who protested, demanded the recognition of rights, and who changed that. And I think that people have forgotten that. Nowadays, people immediately think of the Vietnam War. They think of the Tinker case.
Yeah.
Well, those cases were based on these earlier cases. If one goes down the line, if one thinks about the protection of the news media, the single most important case in the past century, New York Times versus Sullivan, the protection of the news media in its discussions of public officials. Segregation, that was all about demonstrations in the Deep South, segregationists trying to run news media away. If one asks about protections for organizations, organizational privacy, NAACP versus Alabama and other cases. So I think that one thing that needs to be done is simply to reacquaint people with the history of repression. Who has been on the side of repression historically in America, and who has been on the side of freedom of expression? One more thing, and then I'd like to hear your reaction. You know, in 1948, there was a prosecution in Chicago of a white supremacist, Beau Harney,
Yeah.
and he was convicted. He was convicted of group libel, criminal conviction, group libel. And civil liberties folk, and the Supreme Court of the United States upheld the conviction. Civil liberties folk thought this was an error and sought to get the Supreme Court of the United States to revisit the issue, to reconsider its opinion. They went to Mr. Civil Rights, Thurgood Marshall, and asked him to join, which he did. And his basic, there was no one who was a more stout defender of freedom of expression than Thurgood Marshall. And, you know, Mr. Civil Rights, he clearly was a person keenly attuned to matters of racial justice, but his position was, in the long run, freedom of expression will redound to everybody's benefit, including, and in fact, especially, people who are marginalized, people who are going to be on the receiving end of injustice. So that's, I think, just a good dose of civic instruction and history would help things out a good bit. What do you think?
You know, I agree, but I have found in discussions on campuses that sort of pointing out the history and, you know, Martin Luther King or Frederick Douglass or other people's vociferous defenses of free speech and invocations of free speech rights kind of only goes so far. And I think we have to make this sale to a new generation kind of on their own terms. And, you know, I think it's worth referencing the history, and I do in the book, but I think ultimately that's not going to triumph over the concerns that they have. And that's why, you know, I propose, you know, in the book, what it kind of amounts to a new bargain surrounding free speech in terms of how the rights are exercised and how they're defended. Because, you know, I ultimately think that the kind of conscientiousness and care and, you know, willingness to engage in forgiveness and apology, you know, all those elements, you know, in some ways, like, that's what I see kind of softening people up when they take a hostile attitude toward free speech. You know, if there can be a recognition, a greater recognition of the harms that speech can wreak, and of, you know, the differential impact on vulnerable and minority communities, you know, I think that actually goes a long way toward helping people get comfortable with the idea of free speech. And so, you know, I think the history is part of it, but I don't think even a grand, you know, national civics lesson, you know, would sort of turn this around by itself.
I hear you, and I'm sure that you're correct. It won't do everything. I do think it would. I am struck by the degree to which people are unaware. So, for instance, you mentioned Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass in the past few years has come to public consciousness, fortunately, in a wonderful way. Frederick Douglass gave one of the great speeches in favor of freedom of expression when he was mobbed right, you know, in Boston. And he basically said, you know, we abolitionists don't mob the slave power. We let them speak. We have confidence in our view. We have confidence in the ability of people to listen and to be moved. He gave one of the great speeches. Martin Luther King Jr. similarly. So, but no, you're right. It won't do the whole thing. Let me put one other thing on the floor, though. You know, there are going to be conflicts. There are going to be conflicts. And you, I think, very nicely want to embrace. I think my own view sometimes is a bit more tough. And in my own interactions sometimes with folks who want the authorities to shut people up, my response is to say, and they say, this hearing such and such is traumatizing me. They use that word in particular, traumatizing me. And frankly, I say, let me get this straight. You want to change the world. The world is a very tough place. Changing the world, even moving it an inch, is very difficult. You want to do that, and yet you are telling me that you're traumatized about this? I mean, you hear a word, or you hear a sentence, or you hear an idea, and that's going to paralyze you, that's going to incapacitate you. My Lord, if that's true, then I don't see the forces of reform triumphing. You're going to have to be, considerably tougher. I think that I think it seems to me, especially for people who are in the business of social reform, tough-skinnedness, rough-skinnedness, just toughness, and actually inculcating a habit of toughness is, it seems to me, a very important thing. And at least in my discussions in these realms, that's a point that I push. Some people go for it, some don't.
Yeah, look, I agree. Although, what I'm trying to bring to the conversation on that issue, and I think I think free speech defenders historically have been reluctant to acknowledge that speech can cause us harm for fear that doing so opens the door to censorship. And I think that reluctance has backfired. And, to me, it's one of the things that sort of led Toni Morrison in her Nobel acceptance speech to say, words are violence, words can be violence. And this whole characterization of words as, having the capacity to inflict trauma. And what, my view is they do have the capacity to inflict trauma when they're pervasive and it's a pattern that somebody's been dealing with, over time, repeatedly being on the receiving end of slurs, stereotypes, and hateful speech. But something that's incidental, and I give the example in the book, a screening of the movie American Sniper on your campus, no, that cannot inflict trauma on you. And someone asked in the question, does the distinction come down to whether you have a choice to attend or not? I mean, I do think that's part of it, and particularly when it comes to a lecture that you're not forced to sit through, that the idea that could be somehow trauma-inducing is just ridiculous. And even, a discussion, this comes up in, law school conversations about, some tough issues like rape or sexual harassment that, need to be talked about in a legal classroom, and that may evoke memories that are traumatic for people. And I think, it's a reality that you may have some echoes of trauma, but you need to be able to deal with that and have tools and techniques to do so. And that the answer should not be silencing the conversation or not teaching the law of rape at a law school. And so I think sort of acknowledging where the harms can be legitimate, and also saying that they very often are overstated or exaggerated, and maybe even in some instances sort of concocted. I think both things are true, but that the willingness to recognize that there are situations where the harms are real is an important part of the conversation that sometimes gets left out.
Okay. We have a question. I'm going to read it out. How timely to bring these points to us while the painful exchanges from our leaders last night still echo in the air? What do you think brought us to this confrontive front?
Yeah.
So that's right. We're in the middle of a campaign. There was a discussion last night. Having written Dare to Speak, what does the author of Dare to Speak have to say about the discussion and the tenor of it, the rules, the rule breaking. What about that debate? Do you have to, what is it about that debate that you would like to discuss?
Yeah, look, I think it's extremely unfortunate that you had maybe 100 million Americans, watching this sort of, the worst possible example and demonstration of civic discourse that, really was not at all about an engagement of ideas or an effort to, reckon with competing arguments and focus so heavily on denigration, intimidation, disruption. So, I think that's a shame. And how did we get to this moment, which I think the questioner is asking? When Trump was first elected, one of my observations was it's sort of like the Thermidorian phase of the demographic revolution, and that as we're kind of on the cusp as a society, I think of trying to push forward to new levels of equality and inclusivity. And you see this particularly among young people, for whom those ideas, full acceptance of transgender rights and identity are just second nature. Like they're not even a question. And they, kids have grown up kind of living with this from a very young age. And I think they are going to bring about a much different society that is more heterogeneous and accepting of difference. And I think there's this, this harsh backlash that's kind of yanking back by those who are afraid of that and resisting that and have become convinced that that is threatening to their own well-being. I'm optimistic that we'll get past that, partly because, every year there are more 18-year-olds who can vote. I think the other piece of it probably is social media. And there's some interesting work that's been done about how, each successive disruption in our communications technology, whether it's the telephone or radio or the television or the internet and social media, have kind of reshaped our discourse. And I think some of the facets of social media, and I talk about this in the book, how information, ideas travel so often without context, the anonymity of the platforms, et cetera, sort of has given way to this emergence of polarizing vitriol that we have yet to get a handle on.
Are you worried, as many people are, about the specter of true authoritarianism in the United States?
Yeah, I think we have to be worried about it. I'm not convinced it's dawning, but I think everything we feared about this administration, or much of it. I mean, we at PEN America, we did an exercise right after the election looking at, all the dangers we could inventory when it came to free speech. And then we, look back a couple of years later and, with a couple of exceptions, like amending the libel laws, which has not happened, most of them had happened. And so I think, we cannot rest comfortably as long as this president is in office that he won't go to any extreme in order to sustain his power and work his will. And, he said as much. And so I think it's absolutely a risk and a perilous time.
Suzanne Nossel, you have written Dare to Speak, and in a way that's a call to action. Dare to speak. And I very much appreciate your book, and I very much appreciate talking with you, and I wish you all the very best with the book and with your wonderful organization. And I hope that free speech for all will be a banner that we can all march under.
Well, thank you so much. It was so much fun to be back with my former professor, who I've always had such great respect for, getting the chance for a dialogue like this. So it was a real honor to be with you today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good luck.